During the Dark Ages, a legend appeared in Europe telling of a miraculous chalice that promised to all who drank from it eternal wisdom, deliverance from the sufferings of the world, and unlimited power. This chalice was called the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail has been sought for centuries. People are fascinated by its mysteries. One of the many people to join the search for it today is novelist Sabina Truger. Her novels bring the age of legendary King Arthur back to life, and now she decides to investigate his connection with the Grail.
Glastonbury. So the Holy Grail is supposed to have been guarded for centuries in this strange little English country town. I suppose there's no better place to begin my quest. I wonder what those bards would have made of it, who sang of Arthur's quest so many 100 years ago. Modern Grail seekers have settled all over the place here, and some seem to be doing quite good business. Gods and goddesses for the meditation corners of living rooms, healing crystals. I wonder if today's Grail seekers use those. Seems to me that this whole town is making a living out of the Grail. Kind of Grail tourism. The Glastonbury experience. Do I need that? This place seems to be ideal for people who haven't found the Grail. There's something for everyone. What does one need the Grail for these days anyway? Probably there's one for sale on every corner. To see what already has been written upon Merlin and Arthur, I wonder if anyone ever touched their real secrets. Double-pipe Merlins, Excaliburs on special offer, a King Arthur tarot deck. Hello.
It's your first time in Glastonbury?
Yes, I'm interested in King Arthur and the Holy Grail.
Well, you're in the right place. If you just go around the corner into the Abbey, you can see Arthur and Guinevere's graves, for a start.
Just I don't believe it's real. I suspect it's a fake that the monks maybe put up in the 11th century when the abbey burned down, and to be able to collect more money from the pilgrims.
Well, if that's the case, perhaps you should go to Chalicewell Gardens. That's a totally different place. And if you sit there quietly, you may find your Grail.
How can they be distinguished, bogus magic and the ancient power of Merlin? So many charlatans have been toying with the old myths for so long that it's hardly possible to find the truth behind the legend. maybe I should rely on my intuition. Merlin, where are you, old trickster? It was only the books of Jean Marcal that brought you closer to me. Marcal is the only Celtic researcher I've read whose work really conveys the feel of that ancient time, and who interpreted the GRAIL message in a way that makes sense to me. What was it Marcal wrote about the Celts and their holy springs? Here at the base of the Glastonbury Tor, the hill steeped in legends just outside the town, is a holy spring dating from pre-Christian times, the Chalice Well, the GRAIL Well. The contents of the GRAIL? The water of life? Well, it certainly is a weird and special place, a place of meditation and peace. Today, the holy water is guarded by a private foundation, which has laid out a peaceful garden for contemplation. The old spring still bubbles away, hidden deep inside a well. It was beside this well, according to legend, that Joseph of Arimathea buried the GRAIL, after he had founded the first Christian community on English soil here.
Joseph d'Arimathie, nous disent les évangiles, était...
Legend has it that Joseph of Arimathea was actually a secret disciple of Jesus. In Celtic tradition, he is considered to be the granduncle of Jesus, and is also supposed to have been acquainted with Pontius Pilate. It was Pontius Pilate who presented him with a goblet containing a single emerald, the emerald which was supposed to have fallen from the brow of Lucifer when he was banished from heaven. This story corresponds with the Gnostic legends as handed down to us by apocryphal evangelists. It was those same evangelists who also tell us that Joseph of Arimathea used the goblet to collect the blood of Jesus Christ when he was taken down from the cross. To ensure that the goblet was taken to a safe place, Joseph of Arimathea journeyed all the way to Great Britain, to Glastonbury, where, according to the legend, he buried the GRAIL inside a hill, Glastonbury Tor.
à l'intérieur de la colline.
In St. John's Church, the stained glass window tells the story of Joseph of Arimathea. The town does have him to thank, after all, for its famous abbey and for the GRAIL legend. Those tales belong to the heretic Christianity of the Gnostics. It's understandable that the Church of Rome never made the GRAIL legend part of its own body of holy legends. Fortunately, St. John's is an Anglican church. Joseph caught the blood of the Saviour in the GRAIL, and he presented his own tomb to Jesus, below Golgotha, the place of skulls. Every year, Christians from all over the world make the pilgrimage here to the grave outside the walls of Jerusalem. Joseph's tomb is thought to have been rediscovered here, the site of the resurrection, Christianity's greatest mystery. Those who come here are seekers too, either collectively or independently. They want to discover something of Christ's message that cannot be read in the Bible.
Ohne
To how many people of today may the Christian message have a different meaning from that taught by the established churches? And how many different teachings claim to be founded on Christ's message since he was crucified 2,000 years ago? Later, Joseph, a professed Christian, was buried alive inside the wall, not far from the tomb, by the Jews. He survived because he still had the Grail in his possession, and it gave him constant nourishment. 7 years later, Joseph was discovered, young and in the best of strength. He left the Holy Land, traveled across the sea, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and finally arrived at the far-off island in the Western Sea, known to the Romans as Britannia. There, Joseph brought the Grail ashore and founded a Christian community. Legend has it that he became the father of the Celtic Church, which celebrated its own form of Christianity far from Rome, on the green island of bards and druids, in a place where heaven and earth, whether in this life or in the next, lie closer together than anywhere else.
Lorsque le christianisme a pénétré en Europe occidentale,
Before Christianity penetrated as far as the western part of Europe, the Celtic religion was very much controlled and determined by the Druids. They were the priests and shamans of their people. The Druids had a very spiritual view of the world and believed in a life after death in another world. It was because of this that the Christian message was very easily accepted by a large majority of the Celtic population. Indeed, many Druids began to profess the new religion, but they also introduced several metaphysical aspects of their former faith into Christianity. It must be remembered that from the very start, the differences between Celtic Christianity and the Christianity that was being taught in Rome were quite enormous. In the long run, a clash between the Celtic Church and the Church of Rome was thus absolutely inevitable. For the Celts, Jesus and his message became part of Druidic wisdom. For a long time, the bishops of the early church were appointed by Druids, and many converted Druids became powerful missionaries, bearing the new faith to every corner of the Celtic world. In their rituals, however, the Celtic Christians preserved their ancient ceremonies, especially stone and tree worship. Rome attacked this as foolish and misguided superstition. Simply banning it was not enough, however. Numerous stones became associated with Christian legends, and trees were announced to be the statues of saints. Indeed, in the middle of the Irish and Breton countryside today, it's still possible to find statues of saints in the strangest of places. And all of those figures are remnants of an ancient era, lost in the mists of the past.
Des rituels assez étranges qui ne sont pas toujours très bien compris et qui passent pour être des vestiges d'un lointain passé. Je crois que
one of the chief characteristics of the Celtic religion was a deep respect and reverence for nature, for the Celts regarded the beauty of nature as proof of the existence of God.
Contact permanent avec la nature qui est la preuve de l'existence de Dieu.
Today, the magnificent Benedictine abbey that was built on the site founded by Joseph stands in ruins. This place was once the heart of Celtic Christianity, before it was finally forced to submit to the papal authority once and for all. The abbey was not destroyed by Rome, however. Henry VIII took care of that instead. He broke with Rome, founded his own Anglican church, and then plundered and burned every papal abbey and monastery in the country. The golden altars and jewel-encrusted crosses were all confiscated by the crown, and everything else was annihilated, including the monks themselves, if they showed any resistance. Fire and the sword, and the word God on everyone's lips. I wonder what happened to the Grail during all the pillaging. Might it have formed part of some bloodstained booty? Or was it still just a legend that nobody took seriously? Joseph hid them here, the Grail and the Holy Lands. The spear used by Longinus to stab Jesus in the side on the cross. And Arthur? Did King Arthur search for the Grail or see it? Arthur, is he the key to the mystery of the Holy Grail? I don't believe you ever lay in this soil, Arthur. You belong to Avalon, the island of eternal youth in the realm of myth and legend, not the bloodstained soil of history.
Arthur was a historical personality, but he was not a king. He was a general in the Roman tradition, who succeeded in uniting the British tribes in their fight against the Saxons. He scored a major military success near Mount Badon in southwest England and protected the Britons from Saxon rule for around 50 years. He may have begun his campaigns from South Cadbury, a hill fortress surrounded by earthworks in southern England, which dates from as long ago as Roman times. But apart from ancient chronicles and oral tradition, no trace whatsoever can be found of his historic deeds. And the ancient walls can't tell us who ruled here once either.
Arthur is thought to have been born here, in the extreme west of England, on a small rocky island off the Cornish coast. This was the former site of Tintagel Castle, where Arthur's father Uther Pendragon used a magic trick to gain power over the commoner Igraine. He assumed the guise of her husband, who had been killed in the battle, and she thus gave birth to the future king. Uther Pendragon's warriors had laid siege to the impregnable fortress in vain. There was no way to reach the beautiful Igraine, until Uther Pendragon remembered the ancient magic of the Druids and ordered the most powerful of those magicians to be brought to him. Uther Pendragon paid for his trickery with an early death. I wonder what happened to Igraine, Igraine the beautiful. And Merlin. Merlin, you had a hand in all that. Didn't you give Uther Pendragon the magic power to trick Igraine?
Like Arthur, Merlin too was a historic personality. He probably came from an old Scottish family. Legend has it that he went mad after a battle and sought refuge in the woods. There he learned the secrets of nature, of the trees and magic rocks of long ago, in order to pass it on to men later.
Et qui transmet cette science de la nature aux autres.
It was Merlin who was behind Arthur's illegitimate birth, and it was Merlin who later revealed to Arthur that he had a claim to the throne. Merlin gave him back Excalibur, the sword of power. Merlin gave him guidance in the difficult work of day-to-day government, and also in matters of the heart, in order to make a great king out of him. The king whom the realm was expecting, the omnipotent king who would restore peace and greatness. But Arthur only ruled thanks to Merlin, who gave him the spiritual power to do so, the magic knowledge of the ancient Druids.
The sword of power, Excalibur. According to legend, it's beneath the waters of this lake that the Lady of the Lake is guarding it. Arthur, your sword and your power. Did you get it from Merlin or from a woman?
Merlin and Arthur are two very special characters in European mythology, and are in many ways reminiscent of Mitra and Varuna. Mitra is the god of justice and conciliation, the guarantor of contracts, and Varuna is the magician who inspires kings and spurs society on to further developments with his new discoveries. Merlin is also the last of the Druids, exponents of a secret power which has no place in our present age. In Arthurian legend, Arthur does absolutely nothing without asking Merlin's advice first. It is Merlin who leads him on his pilgrimage and gives him direction and guidance, up to the point where Merlin is confident that Arthur has learned to act correctly on his own initiative. This is when Merlin disappears and leaves Arthur to act as best he can. Unfortunately, the legend also relates that even though Arthur did possess druidic wisdom in great measure, he was also an ordinary and very mortal king, with all the human weaknesses that entailed.
Arthur, your country fell into decay when you disowned your wife Guinevere. A flourishing kingdom became a deserted wasteland again, and the GRAIL was your last hope. A wasteland. But your knights couldn't find the GRAIL anywhere. What was the secret of the GRAIL? A drink from it was supposed to restore power to the ailing Arthur. The king launched a quest for the holy vessel. Perhaps its mystery goes even further back, even beyond Joseph of Arimathea. It all started when Arthur disowned his queen. Condemned to be burned at the stake, she fled to a nunnery, Guinevere, betrayed by her royal husband because of jealousy. The dogs of war were unleashed, and the country became a wild battlefield. It was here to the Abbey of Strata, Florida, that the monks of Glastonbury brought their greatest treasure when Henry VIII began his persecutions, a chalice. And when Henry's soldiers burned down this abbey as well, the monks hid the chalice at Nanteus Hall, home of the Paleus family, 20 miles from Strata, Florida.
The cup was brought to Nanteos by the monks from Strata, Florida Abbey during the Reformation, when King Henry VIII was destroying all the monasteries and abbeys, they brought it here for safekeeping. And during that time, it's been in the family for centuries. It's got a great healing power, this cup. And during the last century, the Powell family used to let local inhabitants take the cup away for a penny a night to heal their sick relatives. And many times it would come back with pieces missing, but they would cut the corners off the cup to keep for future use.
And then what happened to the cup?
Unfortunately, the cup is now locked away in a bank vault somewhere in England because Mrs. Powell passed away, and it was left to a great cousin, Mrs. Merrilies. And when she left the house, she took the cup with her, and she's got it locked away. It doesn't actually belong to her. It doesn't belong to anybody.
Were you the keepers of the Grail? Was it kept in a bank safe, like some ancient heirloom? I'm certain the Grail which Arthur was seeking can't be found there. My Grail certainly isn't some long-lost antique.
Actually, the quest for the Grail was like a path towards initiation, similar to the kind that was once experienced here too, among these stones. Each stone had a secret and its own story to tell. What makes the quest for the Grail so remarkable is that it represents a return to the most ancient of archetypes and to the darkest corners of mythology. It is also an adventure story in the sense that we have a mythical hero setting out from home to recover a holy artifact that has been lost and hidden somewhere in the world. The tales of Heracles, of Orpheus, and of Jason and the Argonauts spring to mind, especially Heracles' search for the golden apples from the Garden of the Hesperides. Images like these have been preserved as part of the collective human memory. They are the fruit of our collective unconscious. It was this same memory that created the search for the holy artifact in the novels describing King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table, who set off on their adventurous quest primarily because they wanted to find out for themselves, deep inside, what the meaning of life is all about. They wanted to rediscover the ancient Celtic world they had lost. They were also delving into their own past, searching for a long-forgotten spirituality and clarity. Why was it that the seekers of the Grail had to be pure? It's only those who can liberate themselves from the bonds of reality who find the way to the fairy tale castle, in which the holy vessel, sought by many and found by only very few, is being kept.
Ce château mystérieux où est gardé l'objet sacré que tout le monde cherche, mais que peu vont trouver.
Long before Arthur's time, the Celtic king Bran ruled here, on Dina's Bran. No chronicles mention him, only legends and fairy tales. Bran possessed a special vessel, a cauldron, that could bring the dead back to life. It was a gift from Anwin, the Celtic otherworld. Bran made a present of the cauldron to the Irish, an act of generosity, which resulted in a long and bloody war, in which Bran himself was finally killed. One of the oldest legends about Arthur relates that as a young man he set out with Taliesin to recapture Bran's cauldron from the Irish. The success of this expedition remains uncertain. Only very few survivors returned home to Britain, and Arthur forbade anyone to speak of the episode again. Arthur knew the old songs of his ancestors. They were sung by the bards, those sacred singer-poets in his retinue, like Taliesin. When he was in the woods, he may even have worshipped the staghorn god Cernunnos. Who knows?
Parmi leurs objets, leurs talismans,
one of the magic implements of the Druids was a cauldron that had been brought across from the Northern Islands.
Ce chaudron étant
The cauldron provided endless nourishment for those who deserved it and was considered a source of divine inspiration. Dead people cast inside it were brought back to life. There was another cauldron in Celtic tradition alongside that of Bran, the cauldron of Ceridwen, which fulfilled an oracular function.
Et il y a également le chaudron de Ceridwen qui donne l'inspiration, le don de prophétie, la sagesse.
Here we have the prototypes of the Holy Grail, which, as the receptacle of Christ's blood, can provide eternal life, divine inspiration, and rebirth.
Et peut donner la résurrection.
There is also the famous Skandestrup cauldron, one of the greatest finds of Celtic archaeology, bearing one of the few surviving pictorial representations of Celtic deities. Cernunnos can be seen inside it, also Regani or Rhiannon, the Gaulish Celtic mother goddess, the goddess of the sky and of war. 7 virgins guarded the cauldron. 7 virgins guarded the Grail. Could they have been the servants of the goddess Regani, who once ruled at Cernunnos' side? Is the Grail yours, Regani?
La fontaine de Barenton.
The well of Baraton is the well that makes rain fall from the sky whenever water is poured. The water that falls to the ground is a symbol of life and fertility. The well is female, and it indicates just how important female deities were in the Celtic world. The goddess of water was Viviane. Legend has it that Merlin met her here at the well of Baraton, and Viviane is also the mysterious Lady of the Lake. She is the giver of the life that germinates from the soil, but she is also the sun goddess, because in all Celtic and Germanic languages, the sun is female and the moon male. The female gives life, symbolized by water, and warmth, symbolized by the light of the sun. And Arthur, like all Celtic kings, is incapable of doing anything at all without his wife at his side. In his case, it is Queen Guinevere who gives his kingdom its sense of togetherness and completeness, and also the goddess Viviane, who first gives him the sword of power, Excalibur, and then takes it back to the kingdom of the deep after his death. Because the water preserves the memory of the past, its mysteries and its power. Power is hidden and regenerated within it, like the water from the well, which bubbles and splashes deep inside the earth. The Grail, too, is a vessel guarded by a woman containing a drink that gives wisdom and healing, the blood of Jesus in Christian terms, and in pagan terms, the water from the loins of the earth goddess.
Goddess who disappeared. It was you who owned the Grail, the realm and the sword of power. You were the one Arthur insulted and repudiated when he rejected his queen Guinevere.
Morgane, c'est l'image de la déesse mère.
The goddess Morgana, with her magic mirror, ruler of the Valley of No Return. She is the Earth Mother, the female deity, the keeper of past mysteries. The Druids once had power over nature. They knew the secrets of the occult and could control the elements as they wished. But then they lost their power, doubtless because men are unworthy of possessing such knowledge and such control over natural phenomena. In Celtic tradition, it is only women who are allowed to guard mysteries such as these. They often keep them in the depths of the forest, but also beneath lakes or in ponds, in invisible castles that no ordinary mortal can ever find.
Qui le conservent parfois au milieu des forêts, mais bien souvent sous les eaux où elles ont des châteaux invisibles pour le commun des mortels.
Rhiannon, you were the keeper of the secrets of the earth. It was you who gave the kings their power, and then they rejected you and your earth magic with its stone shrines, and turned to the male god of the Christians with his governor on earth in Rome. Where can I find you, Rigani? Taliesin, Merlin, Arthur, you were servants of the goddesses, but at the same time you were the ones who foresaw and paved the way for the great change that led into a different Christian epoch. But your secret, and the secret of the GRAIL, lay in the betrayed goddesses of your Celtic forefathers. In your legends, they only ever appear as sorceresses or unfaithful queens. Genevieve, Morgana, the Lady of the Lake, was exiled to Avalon, the distant misty island. You were the ones who exiled her, but then you couldn't find her holy vessel anymore. The GRAIL. The GRAIL and the king are one. The country and the king are one. And the GRAIL is a symbol of the country and the goddess, the female vessel.
The GRAIL is represented as a goblet being carried by a very beautiful woman. It is a depiction of the mother goddess who loves and nourishes her children, a myth dating from time immemorial. This myth was almost lost to the Western world, but was then transmitted again by the Celtic poets, the bards, and then adopted yet again by the Christians in the image of the GRAIL. It is for that reason that the legend of the GRAIL has been preserved to this day. We cannot forget what the great mother of pre-Christian times still means to us, the primeval goddess who provides us with our awareness of immortality. But sometimes artists and poets are the only people who can still initiate us into the mysteries of the GRAIL, which is hidden inside an enchanted castle, deep in the forests or on an island somewhere far out to sea.
So could that be the GRAIL? The lost key to the feminine, which men have to rediscover along their path to initiation? In the legend, it's only ever sought by men and always guarded by women. A magic key to the lost world of the goddess.
During the Dark Ages, a legend appeared in Europe telling of a miraculous chalice that promised to all who drank from it eternal wisdom, deliverance from the sufferings of the world, and unlimited power. This chalice was called the Holy Grail. Over 700 years ago, the land of Occitania flourished here between the Pyrenees and the Mediterranean. Troubadours sang their mini-lieder at the royal courts, and the region enjoyed comparative independence from its feudal lord, the King of France. However, when Occitania began to introduce its own form of Cathar Christianity against the will of Rome, the peaceful land was subjected to the horrors of a bloody crusade. In 1243, a mighty army besieged the fortress of Montségur. The last leaders of the Cathar Church put up desperate resistance. The fortress was besieged for 10 months before it finally surrendered. The Cathars asked for a final reprieve from death of 2 weeks in order to take their leave of the world. On the night before the fortress was due to be surrendered, those inside secretly lowered a bundle over the wall. It was followed by 4 Cathar priests. Their breaking of the ceasefire risked instant death. There must have been something important enough inside the bundle for them to want to bring it to safety at all costs. Even today, no one knows what it was, even though the escape of the 4 Cathars was discovered later on. They disappeared into the darkness with their burden. What was it they rescued at the last moment? Was it the gold of the Cathars, secret writings, or was it the Holy Grail? For many years now, Peter Burling has been exploring the mysteries of the Cathars in his historical novels. In his book, Children of the Grail, he describes the last days of Montségur. Preparatory work on a new novel dealing with the connection between Occitania and the Grail has now brought him back here.
22 Cathars were burned to death here after Montségur fell. Almost the entire priesthood, men, women, and children. They offered no resistance as they walked into the flames, dressed solemnly in white. Not one of them renounced his or her faith in order to remain alive. The purity of their souls was more important to them. In 1244, however, their struggle to protect their pure faith, Cathar comes from the Greek word katharos, meaning pure, had been irrevocably lost.
The Cathar Church never recovered from this blow. The fortress at Montségur had been the last bastion of their faith, the Cathar equivalent of Rome. Montségur had been protected by a small army of Occitanian noblemen. With its high walls above steep cliffs, the fortress was virtually impregnable, until the besieging army managed to capture the fortress's outwork in a daring operation under cover of darkness. The now empty castle courtyard was filled with wooden buildings at that time. When the attackers began to fire rocks into the middle of the fortress using a catapult, the Cathar's thick planks must have been their final protection. A strange anteroom has survived to this day. Its windows are arranged with a precision unusual for that time, so that the sun briefly creates 2 spots of light once a year, on the morning of the summer solstice. This must have had a special cult significance. The Cathars were harboring some kind of secret behind these walls, something of fundamental importance to their religion. What became of that treasure? The trail disappears into the deserted regions of the Tibor Mountains, where the last of the Cathars wanted to protect their faith from the horrors of the Inquisition.
Ever since my youth, when I read the books by the German GRAIL scholar Otto Rahn, describing the papal crusade against the GRAIL Church of the Cathars, I've been fascinated by the mysteries of Montségur and its legendary treasure. Can we find any traces of its secrets via the historical records of that time? The defenders of Montségur suffered fates not much better than those of the Cathars. The Inquisition, which was enslaving the country from its base in Carcassonne, never kept its promise of free passage. The soldiers, none of them Cathars, were dragged off to the torture chambers.
Abtrünniger, besinnt euch!
Ich habe keinen Schatz gesehen!
In Gottes Namen besinnt euch, wo ist dieser Schatz? Weiter!
Es gibt keinen! So schenkt mir doch Glauben!
Er lügt, er lügt!
Erbarmen! Was für ein Schatz!
Der Gral.
When my studies in the Pyrenees were interrupted by the onset of winter, I went to Rastenberg Castle, in a remote forested region in the border between Austria and Bohemia. There I met my old friend and Minne scholar Michael Kort, and the lady of the castle, Christiane Singer, Countess Thurn, who has an excellent knowledge of the Middle Ages and owns an extensive library. I thought I might be able to find some new way into the world of the GRAIL here. So many different aspects of medieval culture are connected with this myth, which played a central role for over 100 years in Courtney Minnesang. My thoughts kept returning to the Inquisition and the Cathars. That dreadful institution was created by the popes with the sole purpose of wiping out the Cathars. And the term heretic is only a German distortion of the word Cathar, because soon everyone was branded heretical, whatever their faith. What was it that enraged the Catholic Church so much that it even had self-confessed Christians burnt to death at the stake by the thousand? Was it because they repudiated the papacy and the cult of the Virgin? What exactly was the nature of it? This great heresy perpetrated by Occitania. Didn't the Cathars believe in the coming of the Messiah? And they celebrated Holy Communion too. But they referred to the bread they broke as pan supersubstantialis, an elevated purely spiritual bread. And their Jesus didn't suffer on the cross. He triumphed as a divine being.
Jerusalem, holy city of Jews, Muslims, and Christians. It was here 2,000 years ago that the man whose self-sacrifice became a fundamental belief of numerous churches of varying conviction was tortured, humiliated, and crucified. The wandering tribe of the Jews, with their God Yahweh, came out of the desert to Palestine and turned it into their promised land of Israel. They made the desert fertile and built a temple to Yahweh in their new capital of Jerusalem. 1,000 years later, Israel was a firm ally of the Roman Empire, and via these trade routes, the heart of the Jewish faith had assimilated numerous different intellectual movements: Hellenistic philosophy, Roman statesmanship, Persian cults, and Egyptian mysteries. At this time, the man called Jesus came from Qumran, the Essenian hermitage on the Dead Sea, to announce a new divine message, and he and his disciples traveled up to Jerusalem. Even today, the many and varied influences of Jesus' time are reflected in the interpretation of his message. Alongside the Church of Rome, there is the Orthodox faith of the Greeks and Russians, and the many Protestant and Free Church groups. Even though these forms of Christianity have a lot in common with each other, they have never been in full agreement as to the exact interpretation of the Christian message. In the larger cities of the Roman Empire, and especially in the remote desert regions of Egypt and Syria, groups appeared who connected the cult of the Son of God with heathen traditions or Greek philosophy in such a way that they arrived at an image of Jesus that was entirely different from that of the early Christian church. Many of these new Christians merely considered him to be a spiritual embodiment of God who wanted to bring his message of love to the world in that form. Furthermore, these believers considered the crucifixion to have been a symbolic miracle rather than the death of an actual person, and they rejected all representations of Jesus on the cross as blasphemy. At cult sites, such as the one here in the ruins of the old desert city of Avdad, Jesus was worshipped as a god who had descended, and the doctrine of him becoming man was firmly rejected. A sacrificial altar was built in his honor, and can't have looked much different from the ones built for the other gods. No sign of the cross can be seen anywhere.
There's never been any lack of proof to show that the world is an evil place. So it's really not surprising that the early Christian Gnostics came to the conclusion that the Old Testament God who created the world can't have been a God of love, a kind of devil instead. It was only in Jesus that they saw the revelation of a true and good God, previously unknown to them, who wanted to lead Yahweh's evil creation back toward the light. They rejected the Old Testament and only recognized St. John's Gospel, in which there are several references to a secret message of Jesus which he never actually spoke about.
Anyone insisting on a hidden, secret message was immediately branded a Gnostic and expelled. This marked the beginning of a battle against the Gnostics that became increasingly violent and cruel.
Und ihr glaubt nicht, dass Gott diese Welt erschaffen hat, wie es in der Heiligen Schrift geschrieben steht?
Warum sollte der Gott der Liebe einen solchen Ort erschaffen wie diese Welt mit ihren Foltern und Qualen?
Drücke dich klarer aus, sonst müssen wir dir wieder Schmerzen zufügen. Hat Gott diese Welt erschaffen?
Nein.
Wer dann?
Der Teufel, nicht der gute Gott, der uns in Jesus Christus erschienen ist.
Gottlose Lästerin, wer hat dich diesen Unfug gelehrt? Wer hat dir diesen Irrglauben beigebracht?
Die Welt des Bösen. Sie kennt nur einen Trost, den Graal.
The Grail? Was it a stone from Lucifer's crown? Well, that's how Eschenbach describes it in his Parsifal epic, which was actually written at the time of the Cathars. Might the Cathars not have possessed something, an object, providing proof of the love of that new and strange God of light of Gnostic revelation? Because that seems to be what they followed. Whatever it was, they took it to their secret meetings in the cave region of the Sabates, while they were being persecuted. And there they celebrated their religious rites deep underground in cave churches. Cathar initiation ceremonies took place here even before the Inquisition was formed. The divine spark was lit within the believer to transform him into a perfect person, or perfectus. Were the dark caves a symbol for the darkness of the world which they believed belonged to the devil? It was here that they came to a fateful end, too, when those who had hidden here were quite simply walled in. The mountain became the tomb of the last Cathar bishop. No meat, no eggs, just fish and vegetables, and 3 days fasting every week. The Cathars weren't exactly pleasure seekers. It's quite impressive, though. Their perfecti, their priests, were referred to as bonhommes, literally good men. Religious officials were usually notorious for their love of pomp and their greed. It's no wonder that the Church of Rome was so frightened of ascetic saints like these, who calmly walked into the flames of the funeral pyre with a hymn on their lips.
Like Puylaurens here, the last Cathar fortresses were stormed and destroyed, one after the other. And it wasn't only the Cathars. The entire flourishing culture of Occitania fell victim to the crusade Rome had set in motion. From Caribus, Occitanian nobles waged one final guerrilla war against the invaders from the north, but in vain. And the end of Occitania also marked the end of the culture of courtly love, or minne, in which the love of womanhood had been praised for the first time in woman-hating Papal Europe.
Hi.
You realize that the cult of the Virgin Mary had absolutely no room left for Catharism, quite unlike Rome's early beginnings when the fathers of the Church had to replace the goddesses.
The heathen goddesses.
That's why we have Mary as a mother goddess, then as a virgin, and then even on the sickle moon, too. Cathar women were always independent and self-sufficient.
The world became female, and suddenly woman was no longer a second-class citizen. She was actually the mistress who tamed man and made him her servant. There's a very beautiful German Minnelied about that by Kürenberger, one of the first ever sung by a woman.
Ich zog mir einen Falken, mehr dann ein Jahr, do ich ihn angezammete, und ich ihn wollte han, und ich ihm sein Gefiedere mit Seide wohlbewandt. Hob sich auf viel hoche, und flog ihn an Drüland.
You know what the falcon stands for. That's the ultimate masculine symbol. It was one of the most important matters that the whole feudal system was suddenly altered by the position of the woman, because she could be used to bind the vassal. Women suddenly became a political issue, and the whole loyalty business was a female matter.
Yes, it's very strange that the Cathars and the Minne culture inspired each other, because woman was free under the Cathars, and in the Minne culture she became the mistress. And that's very interesting, and it gave rise to that first flowering of European culture, the troubadour aesthetic. That was in around 1150.
The Minne singers, their songs and epics originated in Occitania. They had a radical effect on medieval courtly life and praised the joys of physical love in no uncertain terms. They also sang of the elevated kind of romantic love, the spiritual ideal of a selfless love, as preached by the Cathars.
Canto, que canto, canto prosperio, canto per mio, que
A world filled to the brim with male violence was suddenly faced with the biggest shock imaginable. The anima had made its reappearance in Europe. Levi-Strauss expressed this magnificently when he said that in the 12th century, Europe lost its big chance to remain female by opting for the bearded prophet instead.
And the bearded prophet, of course, stands for the patriarchate, was implemented by the Church of Rome and favored by Salic law.
There again, in Aquitaine, Salic law did not apply, and that's why Eleanor of Aquitaine was able to inherit that vast country. She thus became de facto its mistress and owner, and married the King of France, who owned a great deal less land at that time. But after 15 years at his side, she had their marriage annulled, because he behaved like a monk towards her. This was scandalous for that time, but an even greater scandal was her subsequent marriage to Henry II, the heir to the English throne. The newly married couple now reigned over a domain that extended from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees and contained a great mixture of cultures, languages and peoples. To hold this kingdom together, Eleanor had a fantastic idea. She created an ideology that gave a new meaning to the old Celtic legends of Arthur and the GRAIL. The idea that a king and his queen, Arthur and Guinevere, had several knights at their court with equal rights. She thus commissioned her court poets to compose texts and melodies, and epics such as Tristan and Isolde.
But what you're forgetting, Michael, what we Europeans like to forget, is that everything that appears noble in our civilization actually came from the Arab world, the aesthetic of love. Stendhal, who studied love all his life, said the same. In the Arabic countries, he wrote, we can discover that life contains many other pleasures, apart from beating each other to death.
Dass es andere Vergnügen gibt, als sich totzuschlagen.
The beauty and solemnity of medieval Gothic cathedrals still impresses us today, but we hardly ever reflect that we have the encounter with Islam to thank for it. After the capture of Jerusalem and the conquest of Spain, the Western world and the Church were appalled at the military superiority of Islam and called the Crusades into being. But even more of a shock in those days was the cultural superiority of Islam as revealed in its architecture and statesmanship. Moorish architects, with their superior knowledge of mathematics, completely overshadowed all the religious buildings created by Christianity up until that time. In the cultural centers of the West, the monasteries, the search began for an answer, and it was this search that eventually produced the blueprints for the great cathedrals. From their rooftops, the demonic faces of gargoyles leered down at the new enemies of the faith. But that wasn't enough of a deterrent for the Church by any means. Western knights rode off to the Holy Land as crusaders against the heathens, and Christian orders of warrior monks were even founded there, the Knights Templar, for instance.
As time went by, the Templars assimilated much that was Oriental. Or did those elements exist even before they were founded? Weren't the assassins supposed to have had a great influence on the Templars?
Not at first, no. But they served as a model, because the assassins were the only known monastic order. They were warrior monks to exist before any of the Christian knightly orders were founded. And they were based in Persia, in Alamut, and actually considered themselves as a force within Islam to combat the Sunnites and defend the Shiite, Ismaili line. Later they set up a base in Syria, right next to the Holy Land. That's where the famous figure of the Old Man of the Mountain originated. They had a very strict hierarchy with a Grand Master as highest authority, and the rules of the order were demanding absolute obedience to death, chastity, and a lack of personal possessions. The Templars adopted all of that, even external features such as the long white coats. The famous clavis of the Templars is nothing less than the clothing worn by the assassins.
Where did these Templars actually come from?
When the Crusaders captured the Holy Land, they established themselves in wealthy coastal towns such as Aachen because their reinforcements came by sea. From there, they set up the Frankish kingdom of Outremer and gradually conquered the Islamic regions further inland. A new culture appeared on the banks of the Mediterranean, containing a mixture of Arab, Norman, and Byzantine elements. From the sea, the streams of pilgrims traveled to Jerusalem, but to get there, they had to cross enemy territory. To protect them, orders such as the Knights of St. John were formed, and also the Templars, who were soon to be far more influential. The Templars didn't just limit themselves to protecting pilgrims, but developed amazingly quickly into a military and economic power right across the Mediterranean. Subject only to the Pope and free from any royal or imperial control, they used their fleet to set up their own trading empire and effectively controlled Jerusalem until the city fell into Muslim hands once more. The name Templar comes from where they were first quartered, on the Temple Mount. During Jesus' time, the Jewish King Herod had an enormous palace built there. He had the entire hill on which King Solomon's temple had stood before its destruction by the Babylonians, surrounded by a wall. At the center was the Sanctum Sanctorum, which the high priest was only allowed to enter once a year. It was from here, 1,000 years later, that the Templars began building up their order, which would soon become associated with many mysteries.
Wenn man heute von den Templern spricht, kommt sofort das Wort Templerschatz ins Spiel.
These days, whenever the Templars are discussed, the Templar treasure is usually mentioned as well. It may or may not have existed, but it could have been all the money they collected during their heyday.
Oder es war überhaupt kein
Then again, it may not have had a material value at all. The word could have been used in an abstract sense, or perhaps it refers to the treasure of King Solomon.
I think we're talking about another treasure here. Not about a material treasure, but about mankind's true treasure. Words. Poetic, prophetic words that make people giddy with yearning for God. That kind of treasure. Like a hand plucking a harp and sounding the strings, the Spirit of the Lord plays across my limbs, and the sound I produce is pure love.
The secrets of the Temple Mount still haven't been fully researched even today. Archaeological excavations are only allowed on the northern wall under the strict supervision of the chief rabbi. Because Mount Moriah, the traditional site of Abraham's first pact with Yahweh, is sacred to both Muslims and Jews, and any further research would be regarded as sacrilege. The Templars, who had their headquarters here in the 11th century, were not subject to such limitations. Their command post still stands today as part of the Islamic Museum of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Beneath these buildings is a labyrinth of passageways which during the Templars' time were referred to as the Stables of Solomon. Whatever the Templars might have discovered here, this place comes closer than any other to the secrets underlying the three revelatory religions.
The head of Baphomet. Here's a full figure representation. Apparently it played an important role for the Templars. After all, their worship of this devil's head was used against them later on.
The death knell of the Templars was sounded in 1307. French King Philip the Fair had all the leading members of the order arrested at dawn. With papal approval, they were tried for heresy and then burnt at the stake.
The head of Baphomet turned out to be the Templars' undoing. It became one of the chief charges against the order. It was probably derived from Baal. It may also have been simply a demon mask, because an actual head was never found. The Inquisition files at the Templars' trial do mention a caput mortuum, so evidence could actually have been found. But no one knows for sure what it really looked like.
Dass man also irgendwo etwas gefunden hat, gesehen, wie das aussieht, weiß kein Mensch.
But all that's really far-fetched. They needed to find an excuse to annihilate the order that was plausible in most people's eyes, and that's why they added all that hocus-pocus. In reality, they were just looking for a pretext to make the Templars' wealth their own.
Of course, there were secret cults within the Templars' ranks as well. The order had a secret statute, and certainly must have had secret knowledge and secret cults, but only for the initiated, that is to say, the upper echelons of the order. The normal knights wouldn't have had access to such things.
There's actually a Templar ruin near here. All that's left is a castle mound, but it's supposed to be riddled with passageways. Secret cult meetings could certainly have been held down there.
Where do you mean?
North of Vienna. The place is called Kronenberg.
Each member of the Templar Order was forbidden under pain of death to tell anyone outside the order anything about its secret rules and rituals. Even when they confessed, they did so to one another. And their castles, almost all of which lie in ruins today, were extraterritorial, as it were, to all secular or religious power. So why were they so secretive if they had nothing to hide? On the Temple Mount or anywhere else in the Holy Land, they could have found enough documents or artifacts to make Christianity appear to them in a different light. Perhaps a find like that turned them into Gnostics, because they always seem to have remained Christian. That Templar cross from Kronenberg must be hanging here somewhere. The one they found during excavations of the castle mound. Cross with a pyramid, possibly an allusion to the esoteric architecture of the Egyptians, which Solomon borrowed when he built the temple, or possibly also a sign of Gnostic rejection of the Catholic cross. With the Cathars and the Templars, all four sides of the cross are the same length. The extension was only added later. Anyway, what this cross does tell us is that the Templars had nothing more in common with the ideas of the Church of Rome. And as for the head of Baphomet, perhaps they didn't worship him at all. He could have been their image of the evil god, the Yahweh of the Gnostics. Perhaps they silently prayed to the new unknown god of the Cathars. A shaft of light. Could it have illuminated a cult meeting here? An encounter with a new god? The Templars and the Cathars, could they have worshipped the same god? Deep under the earth? People could have been consecrated as perfect here. Could rooms like these have been connected with the mystery of the GRAIL? Might there have been initiation ceremonies into its secrets? A simple sacrificial altar without a cross, just like the Cathars. They certainly can't have celebrated Catholic Mass down here.
Rooms for a cult quite separate from the church. They must have existed under every Templar castle. There's a similar place of worship at Lockenhaus too, the last fully intact Templar castle in Europe.
Cult rooms like these can probably be found under every Templar fortress. And you can tell they were secret from the very fact that they were hidden beneath the ground. Otherwise, the ceremonies could have been carried out just as easily in the castle chapel.
Yes, of course they were secret. That's clear. Everything's always secret when a great deal of money is at stake. But there must also have been ritual mysteries, and some of those must surely have been passed down. Because if enough people are in on a secret, it usually gets blurted out eventually.
But the essence of these secrets is that they were not blurted out, not even under interrogation or torture.
Euer verfluchter Orden hat sich vom Teufel verführen lassen. Ihr seid abgefallen vom wahren Glauben. Elender. Habt ihr das Kreuz bespuckt und dem Dämon Baphomet gehuldigt?
Das Kreuz ist eine Lüge.
Habt ihr das Kreuz bespuckt?
Eine Lüge.
Heraus damit, lauter!
Eine Lüge ist das Kreuz.
Das ist Ketzerei. Ihr habt die Heilige Schrift entehrt.
Die Heilige Schrift? Das Lügenbuch der Satanskirche zu Rom?
Lasst die Ketzerei. Gebt zu, dass ihr das Kreuz bespuckt habt. Dann kann euch der Allmächtige verzeihen. Ihr seid irregeleitet durch eure Ordensmeister. Sagt die Wahrheit und ihr könntet gerettet werden.
Ihr wollt belogen werden. Ihr wisst gar nicht, was die Wahrheit ist.
Was ist die Wahrheit? Heraus damit.
Die Wahrheit liegt im Gral, dem heiligen Gral, den ihr nie schauen werdet.
On March the 18th, 1314, the last Grand Master of the Templar Order was burnt to death at the stake in Paris. The order was thus annihilated, but it left a secret heritage.
Wolfram von Eschenbach and the Templar tales of the Grail.
He mentions the Templars, doesn't he?
Yes. He encoded these secrets in his epics, of which Parsifal still remains completely intact. We only know a few lines of his magnificent Titurel, but a melody for them has also been handed down to us. It sounds roughly like this.
Das klingt so. Ich han nach lieben Freunde viel Abend all min schauen aus Fenstern über Heide auf Straße und gein den lichten Auen. Gar verloren, kommet mir zu selten. Des missen mini Augen, Freundes min.
Even if the Templars were keepers of the Grail, as Eschenbach indicates, the Grail was never found inside any of their castles or command posts. Neither was any secular wealth, nor any idols, nor heretical writings. Was the Grail of the Templars and the Cathars actually material and tangible? Whatever the case, the Order managed to keep it safe from outside access very successfully.
The secret knowledge has lasted, though, hasn't it? The Freemasons still base themselves on the Templars even today. It was no coincidence that one of the largest lodges was established in Scotland, because most of the Templars who had to flee from France went to Scotland, and their fleet did too. And the others crossed the Pyrenees to Spain and Portugal, where they continue to exist to this day.
If the Grail of the Templars was their secret knowledge, the divine revelation said to flow from the Grail, then they took it with them, from the Pyrenees to the remote mountains of Scotland. and from there, their knowledge spread to a secret brotherhood that would soon extend its influence throughout the whole world, the Freemasons. From the first Scottish lodge onwards, the Freemasons were guardians of a hidden secret. They called themselves Christian and served an almighty God, but not the God of any particular religion, instead a creator above and beyond all revelation. The set square and trowel are their symbols for the creation of God's temple on earth. In the acceptance ritual and in the later gradual initiation, references are made to the mystery of the temple that was lost when Solomon's architect, Hiram Abiff, was murdered. The Freemasons' secrets are not just so much dead knowledge, but applicable. Their lodges promote enlightenment and the free investigation of matter by a new natural science that is independent from the Bible. From Mozart to Newton, the Freemasons rewrote European intellectual history. The Church of Rome had to capitulate in the face of the secret fraternities whose ideals of freedom, equality, and brotherhood have fashioned a whole new world.
If the GRAIL was the symbol of a divine knowledge alien to the Church with Gnostic roots, then the Templars and their successors, the Masonic lodges, must have drawn a great deal from it.
The former Templar region of London, today the powerful center of justice and finance. With its symbols, Freemasonry assumed the powers of the Templars very early on. In 17th century London, almost all the elite in scientific and political life were Freemasons, and on the continent, their ideals helped to spark the French Revolution. In the newly industrialized society of Queen Victoria's time, the lodges were so powerful that people began accusing them of an international conspiracy. Some people regarded them as harmless patrons of the arts and sciences, while others felt they were secretly controlling world affairs. Masonic symbols can also be seen in the Temple Church. Architecturally, its rounded dome is directly related to that of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Perhaps the Freemason's secret has been concealed by the passage of time, just as the face of the architect who built Temple Church has been rendered unrecognizable by weathering.
The Freemasons themselves have great respect for the Templars. If they discovered something at the Temple Mount, a secret archive with Gnostic writings underlying a new world view, couldn't the GRAIL have simply been the connecting symbol for all this heretical knowledge? For those connections between Freemasons, Templars, and Cathars, between the Temple of Solomon and Gnostic Christianity, one enormous puzzle.
And then the GRAIL suddenly gets brought into all that. You can connect anything at all if you want to. That results in several neat theories, but does it bring us any closer to historical reality?
Well, at least it adds some sense to history, and the Cathars in the fortress at Montségur were certainly guarding a part of that knowledge.
The Church of Mont-Cenis, built by the Templars around 1140, stands in a remote region of the Pyrenees. This remarkable church contains astonishing evidence to show that the Templars had access to knowledge that was quite alien to the Church of Rome and must have dated from pre-Christian times. Symbols of pagan gods of the stars, such as Orion, the great hunter, whose constellation was worshipped by the ancient Egyptians, they aligned their buildings with it. And also the dog star, Sirius, his companion. He is pointing at the stag, which is an old symbol of Christ. The head of the Gnostic Sophia, wisdom, the bringer of cosmic truth, and the sevenfold pyramid. We even encounter the Druid's cauldron again, accompanied by strange patterns that have been deciphered as an Egyptian calendar. The equal-sided cross within a circle, does that stand for another Christian revelation?
Are you making progress, Peter?
I'm having problems with gnosis. Contempt for matter didn't just extend as far as the Enlightenment. It also applies to this day and age. But this contempt for material things and omission of the divine means that on the one hand, material can be used, and on the other that it can be manipulated.
It makes me a bit uneasy too. Wherever there's a cult of purity and contempt for the material world, I sense existential danger and the perils of fascism.
Jede Reinheit ist in sich faschistisch, weil sie intolerant ist.
Every cult of purity is inherently fascistic because it's intolerant and won't allow anything else. And the Cathars have a doctrine that goes so far as to reject propagation and voluntarily chooses death by endura or voluntary starvation in order to enter into the other life.
Indem sie durch Endura, das heißt durch freiwilliges Hungern, das Leben.
But life on earth is not recognized at all. That's the Gnostic side of Catharism. And in the end, it becomes something anti-human, contemptuous of life.
Sitzt und die ist natürlich am Ende menschenverachtend und lebensverachtend.
The GRAIL and the Gnostics, only the purest of the pure were allowed to touch it. Was that a liberation from devilish matter, from the evil of this world in the way the Cathars proclaimed? Was spiritual purity a necessary precondition for drinking divine wisdom from the GRAIL?
That wisdom has continually been revealed to man from a place that is still being fought over fiercely, even today, Jerusalem. Jewish believers are only allowed to approach as far as the western wall of the Temple of Solomon. Yahweh destroyed their temple because they did not obey his law.
They have become too impure to approach the Sanctum Sanctorum. All they can do is wail and mourn their lost proximity to God. A short tunnel runs along the wall, and even closer to the temple, and has thus become the holiest of places. Whoever prays for forgiveness here may have grasped something very important, something that remains alien to adherents of revelatory religions, including the Christians. Perhaps this world was not created in such a way that we can read God's message from it, and that is why we need his mercy more than his knowledge. As long as Yahweh's children keep fighting over knowledge of whatever kind, spiritual or secular, and carrying on persecuting and killing each other for the sake of knowledge, the GRAIL will continue to point to another wisdom that could not be expressed 1,000 years ago, and still cannot today. a transcendental wisdom that is revealed only to very few and can be used by no one. The dome of the Rock of the Muslims. It towers above the place where Abraham made his first pact with the God of Israel. How many prophets since then have delivered continually new divine messages, without man ever having been able to partake of the ultimate, all-embracing wisdom? The wisdom provided by drinking from the GRAIL.
Yeah.